The forest of Maplewood was dense and untamed, stretching for miles with towering pines and thick undergrowth. The early morning mist clung to the leaves, casting an eerie stillness over the woods. It was here, in the heart of the wilderness, that Officer Daniel Rivera, a seasoned park ranger, walked his usual patrol route. His boots crunched against the damp soil as he scanned the surroundings for any signs of disturbance. He had been working in these forests for over a decade, witnessing everything from illegal poaching to lost hikers, but today, something felt different. The usual harmony of the woods, chirping birds, rustling leaves, was broken by a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A whimper. Rivera stopped. His breath hitched. He listened carefully, turning his head toward the source. The sound was weak, fragile, barely clinging to existence. It came from the thickets ahead, where the underbrush was thick and uninviting. Instinct took over. He pushed forward, his hands parting the dense foliage. The moment his eyes landed on the creature before him, his heart clenched. A small, frail puppy lay curled against the roots of an old oak tree. Its fur, once golden, was now matted and dull, covered in dirt, dried blood, and patches of missing hair. Fleas swarmed across its emaciated body, and the skin underneath was riddled with raw wounds from relentless scratching. Its ribs protruded through its thin frame, a clear sign of starvation. Most heartbreakingly, its eyes, dull, lifeless, barely able to focus, held a look of complete surrender. Rivera knelt, careful not to startle the fragile creature. "Hey there, buddy," he whispered, his voice soft, barely audible. "You're okay now? I'm here." The puppy flinched at the sound but didn't move, too weak to resist. Rivera's throat tightened. He had seen animals in distress before, but something about this tiny suffering creature struck a deeper chord. It had no fight left in it. It had given up. Not today. Without hesitation, he unzipped his jacket, gently scooped the puppy into his arms, and wrapped it securely against his chest. The little body was alarmingly light, barely more than skin and bones. The puppy let out a barely audible sigh and rested its head against his arm as if realizing, maybe for the first time, that it was safe. As Rivera turned back toward the ranger station, he whispered, "You're going to be okay, I promise." He had no idea then that this rescue would set off a chain of events that would change not just the puppy's life, but the entire town of Maplewood. The ranger station was a 20-minute hike away, but Rivera moved faster than ever. His boots splashing through mud and leaves. The weight of the puppy was barely noticeable, yet the burden of responsibility felt immense. At the station, he burst through the door, startling his colleague, Officer Jake Collins, who had just sat down with a cup of coffee. "Whoa, Danny, what the hell?" Collins' words caught in his throat when he saw what Rivera was carrying. A puppy? Rivera unwrapped his jacket, revealing the small, trembling creature inside. Collins winced at the sight. "Jesus, it's in bad shape." "Bad is an understatement," Rivera said grimly. "We need a vet. Now." Collins nodded, already reaching for the radio. "I'll call Dr. Carter." Rivera nodded and turned his attention back to the puppy. He could feel its shallow breaths against his arm. Time was running out. Dr. Emily Carter arrived at the ranger station within 30 minutes, her medical bag in hand. She was one of the best veterinarians in Maplewood, calm under pressure, fiercely dedicated, and unshakable when it came to saving lives. The moment she saw the puppy, her expression darkened. "Let's get him on the table," she instructed, her voice firm but gentle. Rivera carefully placed the puppy down. It let out a weak whimper as Dr. Carter's skilled hands began examining its frail body. She worked quickly, scanning for injuries, checking for dehydration, and assessing its overall condition. She used a flea comb to lift a section of fur, revealing hundreds of fleas crawling beneath. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. "Flea infestation is severe. Malnutrition too. He's dangerously anemic." Rivera clenched his fists. "Can you save him?" Dr. Carter looked up. "I'll do everything I can, but he's got a long fight ahead." She turned to her assistant, Lisa. We need flea treatment, antibiotics for the infections, IV fluids, and a special diet to get his strength up. Lisa nodded and got to work. Rivera felt a pit in his stomach as he watched. The puppy lay motionless on the table, too weak to react. Dr. Carter carefully placed an oxygen mask over its tiny snout. "What's his name?" she asked. Rivera hesitated, then said, "Bailey. His name is Bailey." Dr. Carter smiled faintly. "Bailey it is." Over the next few hours, the team worked tirelessly. They carefully applied flea treatment, watching as the parasites began to fall away. They cleaned his wounds, soothing the raw, irritated skin. They started him on a slow IV drip, replenishing the fluids he had lost. Lisa offered him a tiny syringe of liquid food. At first, Bailey didn't respond. But then, in the smallest of miracles, he licked at the syringe. Rivera exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "He's fighting," Dr. Carter said, nodding. "That's a good sign." Bailey was not out of danger yet, but for the first time since Rivera had found him in the forest, there was hope. And hope, Rivera knew, was sometimes all you needed to survive. Bailey's journey was only beginning. The mystery of how he ended up in the woods remained unsolved. But as Rivera looked down at the tiny creature resting under the warm light of the vet clinic, he knew one thing for certain. Bailey had a reason to keep fighting, and so did he. Bailey lay motionless on the examination table, his shallow breaths barely visible. His body, ravaged by starvation and flea infestation, was in a critical state. Dr. Emily Carter had seen cases like this before, abused, neglected animals left to die. But something about Bailey struck a deeper chord. Perhaps it was the way his tiny frame had fought to hold on despite the odds, or the way his dull, lifeless eyes had flickered ever so slightly when she spoke his name. She wasn't going to let him die. Lisa, her assistant, worked swiftly to prepare the necessary medications. The IV fluids were already dripping into Bailey's fragile veins, replenishing what he had lost. The next step was treating the fleas that had nearly drained him of life. "Okay, we need to go slow," Dr. Carter instructed. "His body is too weak for an aggressive flea bath, so we'll use a diluted treatment and remove the rest manually." Rivera, who had stayed by Bailey's side, watched with concern. "You're saying fleas did this to him?" His voice was tight, barely containing his anger. "Not just the fleas," Dr. Carter corrected. "Fleas alone might not have been fatal, but in his condition, malnourished, dehydrated, left to survive alone in the wild, they were a death sentence." Lisa carefully applied a mild flea treatment to Bailey's fur, avoiding the open sores. Within minutes, fleas started to drop off, some still twitching. She used a fine-toothed comb to remove the stubborn ones, while Dr. Carter gently wiped away the flea dirt, tiny specks of dried blood, evidence of just how much they had fed on him. Bailey whimpered weakly, his body flinching at the sensation. "Easy, baby," Lisa murmured, her voice soothing. "We're getting them off you." Rivera clenched his fists, watching as more fleas fell away. Each one felt like a tiny symbol of suffering, a parasite that had feasted on Bailey's pain. "How long until he's out of danger?" he asked. Dr. Carter sighed, exhaustion in her eyes. "It depends. The next 24 hours are critical. If his body starts responding, if his temperature stabilizes, if he eats, he has a chance." Rivera nodded, his jaw set. He wasn't leaving until he knew Bailey would make it. The next few hours were tense. Bailey remained unresponsive at first, his tiny body too weak to do more than breathe. But the IV fluids slowly did their job, bringing warmth back to his cold limbs. By the evening, Lisa attempted to feed him again, offering a tiny spoonful of high-calorie recovery formula. At first, Bailey didn't move. Then, just as Rivera was about to lose hope, the little pup flicked his tongue over the food. It was barely a lick, but it was enough. Lisa beamed. "That's a good boy, Bailey. Just a little more." Bailey licked again, this time with slightly more effort. It wasn't much, but it was the first real sign that he was still fighting. Rivera exhaled heavily, running a hand over his face. "He's trying," he muttered. Dr. Carter smiled softly. He's got a strong spirit. Rivera glanced down at Bailey, his chest tightening. Yeah, he whispered. He does. While Bailey's condition was slowly stabilizing, questions still lingered. How had he ended up in the forest? Why was he alone? And, most disturbingly, was someone responsible for abandoning him there? Rivera couldn't shake the feeling that Bailey's suffering wasn't just an accident. A puppy this young wouldn't have survived on his own for long. Someone had left him to die. After making sure Bailey was resting comfortably, Rivera pulled out his phone and made a call. Collins, it's me. Hey Danny, how's the pup? He's hanging on, Rivera said. But listen, I need you to check the missing dog reports. See if anyone's looking for a lost German Shepherd puppy. Collins hesitated. You think someone dumped him? I don't know, Rivera admitted, but I want to find out. Collins sighed. All right, I'll check the system. But you know how it is, people dump dogs all the time and no one reports it. I know, Rivera said grimly, but if someone did this to him, I want to make sure they don't do it again. As night fell, the clinic quieted down. Lisa had gone home, and Dr. Carter finished up paperwork. Rivera stayed. He refused to leave Bailey alone. The tiny pup now lay in a soft bed, a heated blanket draped over him. His breathing was slow but steady. Every so often he would stir, his little body twitching in his sleep. Rivera sat beside him watching. You're safe now, buddy, he murmured. No more suffering, no more pain. Bailey didn't respond. But Rivera could swear he saw his tiny tail flick. Just the smallest movement, barely noticeable. For the first time, Rivera allowed himself to hope. Bailey was going to make it. And when he did, Rivera was going to find out who had abandoned him. Because no one deserved to suffer the way this little puppy had. Bailey stirred as the first light of dawn filtered through the clinic windows. His frail body, once rigid with exhaustion, was now beginning to regain warmth. His breathing, though still shallow, was steady. Rivera had barely slept. He sat in the chair beside Bailey's bed, one hand resting gently on the pup's side, as if making sure he was still there. Dr. Emily Carter walked in, holding a cup of coffee. She smiled slightly when she saw Rivera still there. You stayed all night? Rivera shrugged, eyes still on Bailey. Didn't feel right leaving him alone. Dr. Carter checked Bailey's vitals, nodding in approval. He's responding well. Flea treatment worked, his hydration levels are improving, and, she lifted Bailey's lips slightly to check his gums, his color's better. He's still got a long road ahead, but he's fighting. Rivera exhaled in relief. That's good to hear. Lisa arrived shortly after, carrying a fresh batch of warm towels. I heard our little warrior made it through the night, she said, kneeling beside Bailey's bed. Morning, sweetheart. Ready for breakfast? Bailey lifted his head slightly, his deep brown eyes locking onto hers for a brief second. Then, to everyone's surprise, his tiny tail gave the faintest wag. Rivera blinked. Did you see that? Lisa grinned. Oh yeah, I saw it. Someone's feeling a little better. Bailey was nowhere near fully recovered, but that little tail wag was the most hopeful sign yet. While Bailey rested, Rivera turned his focus to finding out how he had ended up in the forest. The first step was checking missing dog reports. He had asked Officer Collins to look into it, and by midday, Collins called back with an update. Nothing matches exactly, Collins said over the phone. No reports of a lost German Shepherd puppy fitting Bailey's description, but I found something interesting. Rivera leaned forward. I'm listening. A couple of hikers reported hearing barking near Pine Hollow Trail about 2 nights ago. They thought it was a stray, but when they got closer, the barking stopped. They figured the dog ran off, so they didn't investigate further. Rivera frowned. Pine Hollow Trail was a secluded part of the forest, far from any residential areas. A puppy like Bailey wouldn't have wandered there alone. Sounds like someone dumped him, Rivera said, his voice tight. That's what I'm thinking, Collins replied. No way a pup that young survived out there on his own. Someone left him to die. Rivera's grip on the phone tightened. I need to check it out. Can you meet me there? I'm off duty in an hour. I'll bring my flashlight. Rivera hung up and glanced back at Bailey, who had drifted off into a peaceful sleep. He gently brushed his hand over the pup's head. We're going to find out who did this to you, buddy. Later that evening, Rivera and Collins arrived at Pine Hollow Trail. The forest was quiet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. This is where the hikers heard the barking, Collins said, pointing to a clearing near the entrance of the trail. If Bailey was here, we might find something. The two officers searched the area carefully. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just fallen leaves and scattered twigs. But then, Rivera noticed something near the base of a tree. A small, chewed-up rope. He crouched down, inspecting it closer. The frayed edges suggested it had been gnawed on, possibly by a desperate dog trying to free itself. Collins, he called. Collins walked over and whistled. That looks like a leash. Rivera picked it up, his mind racing. Had Bailey been tied up here before managing to break free? A few feet away, they found another clue. A plastic food wrapper, half buried in the dirt. Rivera held it up. This is fresh. Someone was here recently. Collins nodded. This might be our dumping site. Rivera's jaw clenched. Someone left Bailey here, tied up and alone. Collins exhaled. We need to find out who. Rivera took pictures of the evidence and bagged the leash for analysis. If there were fingerprints, they might get a lead. Whoever abandoned Bailey thought they had gotten away with it. They were wrong. As Rivera drove back to town, his mind raced with possibilities. If Bailey had been dumped, it meant someone wanted to get rid of him. But why? His phone buzzed. It was Olivia Reed, the investigative journalist. Rivera, she greeted. Heard you were looking into a case. You heard right, Rivera said. What do you know? More like what I might be able to find out, Olivia said. A contact of mine at Animal Control mentioned an increase in abandoned dogs recently. Not just strays, dogs that seem to have been deliberately dumped. Some were found in bad shape, like Bailey. It could be connected. Rivera's grip on the steering wheel tightened. You think someone's running a puppy mill or backyard breeding operation? It's possible, Olivia said. People breed dogs for quick cash, and when they can't sell them, they dump the undesirables. The sick, the weak, the ones that won't bring in money. Rivera's stomach turned. The thought of Bailey being discarded like trash made his blood boil. Can you get me names? He asked. I'll see what I can dig up, Olivia replied. If there's something shady happening, we'll expose it. Rivera ended the call and exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about Bailey anymore. If someone was dumping unwanted puppies in the forest, then Bailey might not be the only victim. And Rivera wasn't going to stop until he found the truth. When Rivera arrived back at the clinic, Bailey was awake. The pup lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Rivera's. For the first time, there was something different in his gaze. Recognition, trust. Rivera knelt beside the bed, resting a hand on Bailey's side. Hey, buddy, he murmured. Guess what? We're going to find out who hurt you, and we're going to make sure it never happens again. Bailey let out a tiny, tired sigh. Then, ever so gently, he nudged his nose against Rivera's hand. It was small, but it was enough. Bailey was safe now, and whoever had abandoned him, they weren't safe anymore. The morning air was crisp as Rivera parked his patrol car outside the Maplewood Veterinary Clinic. He took a moment to sip his coffee, his thoughts still lingering on the evidence he and Collins had found at Pine Hollow Trail. The frayed leash, the food wrapper, it all pointed to one thing. Someone had dumped Bailey, and Rivera was going to find out who. Inside the clinic, Bailey was curled up on his bed, his body still frail but no longer trembling. His fur was cleaner, and though the patches of missing hair where the fleas had ravaged his skin were still visible, there was life in his eyes now. Lisa knelt beside him, speaking softly as she refilled his water bowl. Morning, Bailey, Rivera said, crouching beside him. The pup lifted his head, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of Rivera's voice. "He's getting stronger," Dr. Carter said as she walked in. "Still underweight, but he's eating and responding well to treatment." Rivera nodded, relieved. "That's good to hear." But even as he watched Bailey, his mind was on the investigation. Someone had left him in that forest, tied up and alone. Someone had meant for him to die there. Rivera wasn't going to let that go. Back at the precinct, Collins was already at his desk, typing away. He looked up when Rivera walked in. "Got something for you," Collins said, pushing a printed report across the desk. "We ran the leash for prints. Got one partial, but it's not in the system." Rivera sighed. That was a setback. "But," Collins continued, "I checked around with local shelters. Turns out Bailey might not be the only dog that's been dumped recently." Rivera's eyes narrowed. "How many others?" "At least 5 in the past month. All found in remote areas, forests, abandoned farms, outskirts of town. And get this, most of them were German Shepherd mixes." A chill ran down Rivera's spine. "Someone's getting rid of dogs," he muttered. "Yeah," Collins agreed, "and I don't think it's random." Rivera clenched his jaw. If Bailey had been part of a larger pattern, then this wasn't just about one cruel person abandoning their pet. This was bigger. And it was starting to look a lot like a backyard breeder dumping unsellable puppies. That afternoon, Rivera met with Olivia Reed, the investigative journalist who had been digging into similar cases. She slid a notepad across the cafe table. "Got a name for you," she said. Rivera picked up the notepad. The name scribbled on it sent a jolt of recognition through him. Mason Harlow. Rivera exhaled. He knew that name. Harlow was a known breeder in the area, someone who sold purebred German Shepherds for profit. But his operation had always been shady, unregistered, unregulated, and rumored to be cutting corners. "Word is," Olivia continued, "Harlow's been struggling to sell some of his litters. People are getting pickier about buying dogs, and he's been left with a bunch of puppies he can't sell." Rivera's hands curled into fists. "So he's dumping them." "Looks that way," Olivia said grimly. "And if Bailey was one of his, we might have proof." Rivera wasted no time. He was going to pay Mason Harlow a visit. The sun was setting when Rivera pulled up to Harlow's property. The place was run down, an old farmhouse with a rusted truck parked out front. A chain-link fence surrounded a yard filled with makeshift kennels. Rivera knocked on the door. After a few seconds it creaked open, and Mason Harlow stood there squinting at him. He was a man in his late 40s, his face worn and lined from years of hard living. "Officer," Harlow said, his tone wary. "What brings you out here?" Rivera kept his expression neutral. "Just following up on a case. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Harlow hesitated, but stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and something else, something foul. Rivera's eyes swept the room, noting the stacked dog food bags and muddy footprints leading from the back door. "You run a breeding operation, right?" Rivera asked casually. Harlow nodded. "Yeah, German Shepherds. Good bloodlines." "You sell all your puppies?" "Most of them." Rivera tilted his head. "And the ones you don't?" Harlow stiffened. "What's this about?" Rivera leaned forward. "A puppy was found abandoned in Pine Hollow Trail a few nights ago. German Shepherd mix. Malnourished, covered in fleas. He was tied up, left to die." Harlow scoffed. "What's that got to do with me?" Rivera pulled out his phone and showed Harlow a picture of Bailey, taken just after his rescue. The moment Harlow's eyes flickered with recognition, Rivera knew. "You tell me," Rivera said coldly. Harlow's jaw tightened. "I don't know that dog." "Lying to a cop isn't a good look," Rivera said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "I've got witnesses, evidence. And if I find proof that you've been dumping dogs, you're looking at animal cruelty charges." Harlow's hands clenched at his sides, but he stayed silent. Rivera stepped closer. "So here's your chance to make this easy. You tell me how many you dumped, where, and maybe, just maybe, you won't be going to prison for a long time." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Harlow exhaled sharply and muttered, 2 litters. Couldn't sell 'em. Thought they'd fend for themselves. Rivera's stomach turned with disgust. You thought wrong. By the next morning, Harlow was in handcuffs. With Olivia's investigative work and the evidence Rivera had collected, there was enough to charge him with multiple counts of animal cruelty and abandonment. The news spread quickly, and soon Harlow's operation was shut down. The remaining dogs were seized and placed in the care of shelters, where they would finally have a chance at a real home. At the clinic, Rivera sat beside Bailey's bed, stroking the pup's fur. "You did it, buddy," he murmured. "You didn't just survive, you helped save the others, too." Bailey let out a small, contented sigh and nudged his nose against Rivera's hand. He was safe now. And because of him, so were many others. Bailey had come a long way from the starving, flea-ridden pup Rivera had found in Pine Hollow Trail. His fur had begun to grow back, filling in the patches where the fleas had ravaged his skin. His ribs, once stark beneath his thin coat, were now covered by healthy weight. But more than that, his spirit was healing. He no longer cowered when someone reached out to pet him. He wagged his tail when Lisa brought him food. He had even started playing, cautiously nudging a stuffed toy with his nose before giving it a playful bite. It was a transformation that made Rivera's chest tighten every time he saw it. Dr. Carter watched Bailey carefully as he gnawed on a rubber chew toy. "He's a different dog now," she said. Rivera nodded. "Yeah, but he still doesn't have a home." Lisa glanced between them. "You know," she said slowly, "Bailey seems to like you more than anyone else." Rivera opened his mouth to protest, but Lisa grinned. "Just saying." Rivera sighed, looking down at Bailey, who had trotted over to sit beside his chair. The pup leaned against his leg, resting his head on Rivera's boot. "Yeah," Rivera murmured. "I know." 2 days later, Rivera walked back into the clinic with a folder under his arm. Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow as he placed it on the reception desk. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked. Rivera sighed. "Yeah." Lisa practically squealed as she flipped through the papers. "You're adopting him." Rivera rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, I wasn't planning on getting a dog, but—" He glanced at Bailey, who was now wagging his tail, sensing the excitement. "I can't imagine him being anywhere else." Dr. Carter smiled warmly. "You're doing a good thing, Rivera." Rivera smirked. Yeah, don't get all sentimental on me." Lisa laughed. "Too late." Bailey, as if understanding what was happening, jumped up and licked Rivera's face. Okay. Rivera chuckled, gently pushing him back. "I get it, buddy. We're stuck with each other now." Bringing Bailey home was an adjustment for both of them. At first, Bailey paced Rivera's small living room, sniffing every corner, hesitant to settle. He had spent his life in survival mode. Trusting a new environment wasn't easy. Rivera didn't rush him. He let Bailey explore at his own pace, leaving the back door open so he could step outside if he wanted. He set up a soft dog bed in the corner, but to no one's surprise, Bailey ignored it and curled up near the front door instead. Rivera sighed. "You're not waiting for someone else, are you, buddy?" Bailey lifted his head but didn't move. Rivera knelt beside him, stroking his fur. "You don't have to wait anymore," he murmured. "You're home now." That night, for the first time, Bailey fell asleep without keeping one eye open. For weeks, Bailey adjusted to his new life. He followed Rivera from room to room, ate heartily, and even learned to fetch. But the nightmares still came. Some nights, Rivera woke up to soft whimpers. He would find Bailey curled up, shaking not as if reliving the cold, the hunger, the fear of being alone in the forest. Rivera sat beside him, rubbing his back until the trembling stopped. "You're safe," he whispered. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Bailey pressed closer, reassured by the steady presence of the man who had saved him. One evening, Rivera took Bailey for a walk through Pine Hollow Trail, the very place he had been abandoned. Bailey hesitated at the tree line, sniffing the air cautiously. Rivera knelt beside him. "It's just a place, buddy. It doesn't own you anymore." Bailey looked up at him. Then, with surprising confidence, he took a step forward. They walked together, side by side, through the forest. Bailey sniffed the leaves, perked his ears at the rustling sounds, and for the first time, wagged his tail in the place that had once been his prison. Rivera felt a lump rise in his throat. "You're stronger than you know," he murmured. Bailey leaned against his leg. Maybe they both were. Months passed, and Bailey became more than just Rivera's dog. He was his shadow, his best friend. He rode shotgun in the patrol car, watching the world go by. He greeted Rivera at the door every night, tail wagging furiously. And when Rivera sat on his porch with a beer after a long day, Bailey was always right there beside him. One afternoon, Lisa and Dr. Carter stopped by to visit. "You know," Lisa teased, watching Bailey nuzzle Rivera's hand, "I think he adopted you more than you adopted him." Rivera smirked. "Yeah, well, guess we both got lucky," Dr. Carter smiled. "You saved him, Rivera." Rivera looked down at Bailey, who was watching him with eyes full of trust. "No," he said softly. "He saved me too." Bailey let out a happy bark, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly as it should be.